My life always seemed perfect. I was married to David, we had a beautiful house, stable jobs, and everything I could ever want. We cared for each other, had our little routines, and there was no real conflict between us. Everything appeared ideal, and for a while, I convinced myself it was enough. We were happy. I was happy. At least I thought so. But the longer I lived in this so-called blissful existence, the more I began to feel a hollow emptiness creeping in. It wasn't loneliness, nor was it depression. It was something more subtle, something that tugged at the edges of my consciousness. Something was missing, and I couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until the quiet of night, when I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, that the feeling became overwhelming. My thoughts would circle, restless and unsure, as if searching for the reason behind it all. I would tell myself it was just my mind overthinking, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. Something inside me was yearning for more. David, for all his reliability and calm, seemed to be as unaffected by it as I was. He went to work, came home, made dinner, and we did our usual nightly routines. He was a comforting presence, but there was a lack of passion, of fire, that I used to feel when we first got together. Now, when his hand brushed mine, it felt like the touch of a stranger. Not in a bad way, just distant, familiar, but empty. There was no spark, no electricity. I wanted to tell him, to admit it out loud, but I couldn't bring myself to. I wasn't sure what I was even feeling. How could I explain that the very stability I once craved now felt like a cage? How could I admit to myself that I wanted something more, but had no idea what that more was? Every day I pushed the feeling aside. I told myself it was just a passing phase, but deep inside, I knew it wasn't. Something was changing, and I couldn't stop it. It all started on an ordinary day at work. We had just hired a new colleague, Jason, and I didn't think much of it at first. He was younger than me by a few years, maybe 5 or 6, and appeared somewhat out of place among the usual crowd. He was still getting acclimated, but there was something about the way he carried himself, something confident and self-assured, that caught my attention. At first, it was nothing. A simple introduction, a polite handshake, the usual office pleasantries. But then, one afternoon, our eyes met across the room. It was brief, but there was an undeniable connection in that glance, a spark, almost like an electric current passing through the space between us. I couldn't quite explain it, but it was there. I quickly looked away, embarrassed by the sudden rush of warmth that spread through me. It wasn't just his looks, it was something else. His gaze was intense, steady, as though he could see right through me. It wasn't the kind of look you give a colleague. It was something more, something personal. My heart skipped a beat. I had to shake it off. After all, he was just a new colleague, and nothing could come of it. But the feeling lingered. The more I interacted with him in passing, quick exchanges in the hallway, small talk over coffee, the more I realized how drawn I was to him. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that was certainly there. It was the way he made me feel seen, like he wasn't just talking to me because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to. In every conversation, I felt my walls slowly start to crumble. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to crave more of his attention. Every smile, every word exchanged felt significant, like I was a part of something that had been missing from my life for a long time. With Jason, I didn't feel invisible. I felt alive. But I kept pushing those thoughts away. After all, I was married, and I loved David. Wasn't that enough? The tension between wanting to be close to Jason, yet feeling guilty for even allowing myself to entertain the idea, began to grow. I told myself it was just a passing fascination. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something I wasn't ready to confront. That evening, David and I sat down for dinner, as we always did. The light from the kitchen dimmed, casting soft shadows around us as he began talking about his day. He was recounting some work issue with a colleague, and I listened, nodding politely, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't help it. Every time I glanced at David, I noticed the calmness in his face, the kind of serenity I had once found comforting, but now felt suffocating. He was still the man I had married, the one I had built this life with. But somehow tonight, everything about him felt distant, as though a gap had opened between us, and I couldn't quite bridge it. He smiled, a soft and easy smile, and took my hand across the table, the same gesture we'd shared countless times. But as his fingers wrapped around mine, there was no thrill, no pulse of excitement like there used to be. It felt more like a routine, a comforting, familiar routine, but that's all it was. Nothing more. I forced a smile, but it felt hollow. I didn't want to hurt him, to disrupt our stability, but something inside me was screaming that I couldn't keep pretending. My thoughts kept drifting to Jason. His eyes, his smile, the way he seemed to truly listen when I spoke. How long had it been since anyone made me feel that way? "Is everything okay?" David's voice brought me back to the present, and I realized I had been staring off into the distance, lost in thought. "Yeah," I lied, trying to hide the truth behind a smile. "Just tired, I guess." David nodded and continued talking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something was off. He didn't press, though. He never did. That was part of what I admired about him. He respected my space, never pushed me to open up when I wasn't ready. But tonight, I wasn't sure I could keep the walls up. Every word he said, every glance he gave me, felt like it was reinforcing the distance between us. And all the while, I could still feel the pull of Jason's gaze from the back of my mind, his presence a constant whisper at the edges of my thoughts. As I finished my dinner, I tried to focus on the conversation, but a part of me, a growing part, longed for something more. Something that I couldn't find here, not anymore. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I felt it in my chest, a longing that wouldn't go away. It was there, alive, in the spaces between the words David spoke, in the silence that stretched between us. I didn't know it then, but that evening, the chasm between us would only grow. And I was beginning to realize that the life I thought I was content with was no longer enough to satisfy the ache I couldn't ignore. The following days blurred into one another, but there was a change in the air, something I couldn't shake. Every morning when I arrived at work, I felt an almost magnetic pull toward Jason. I didn't even have to see him to know he was nearby. I could sense his presence like an invisible force drawing me in. It was both thrilling and unnerving. I told myself that it was nothing, that I was just imagining things, but when I passed him in the hallways or caught a glimpse of him from across the office, my heart would quicken, and the world around me would seem to fade into the background. I'd become hyper-aware of every small detail, the way his voice carried when he spoke, the faint cologne that lingered in the air after he passed by, the casual way he would smile when we exchanged a word. Our conversations had become a routine, but not like the ones I had with David. With Jason, it was different. Every exchange felt charged, like we were speaking in some secret language, one only the two of us understood. I found myself looking for these moments, seeking out opportunities to talk to him, to be near him. The thrill of our conversations, even if they were trivial, was something I hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, as I was gathering my things to leave, Jason lingered by the door, leaning against the frame. "Heading out for the day?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes held something more, something deeper than mere politeness. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound normal, trying to hide the way my pulse raced. "Just another long day." He smiled, and for a split second, our gazes locked, the silence between us thick with something unspoken. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't crazy. There was something here, something real. I could feel it in the air, in the way he looked at me, the way my body responded to his mere presence. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said softly, his voice lower than usual. I nodded, forcing a smile, but as I walked past him, something inside me tightened, pulling me toward him like gravity. I could feel the tension between us, the unacknowledged desire that simmered beneath the surface. I should have left, should have walked out of the office and gone home to my life with David. But instead, I found myself lingering just a moment longer, stealing one last glance back at him before I turned the corner. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. And with that small, fleeting interaction, I knew that whatever I had with David, whatever comfortable life I had built, wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't enough to quiet the pull I felt toward Jason. The tiny moments with him, those fleeting exchanges, were becoming something I craved more than I was willing to admit. And every time we spoke, I could feel myself getting closer to something I couldn't turn away from. The turning point came on a quiet Thursday evening. I had stayed late at work, finishing up some reports, when I saw Jason packing up his things as well. I wasn't sure why, but something nudged me to make the first move. "Long day?" I asked, walking over to where he stood by his desk. He looked up with that signature smile, the one that always made my heart race. "You could say that. I'm thinking of grabbing a coffee before I head home. Want to join me?" I hesitated, surprised by the invitation. A part of me wanted to decline, to walk away and return to my predictable life with David, but another part of me, the part that had been yearning for something more, couldn't resist. "Sure," I replied, almost too quickly. "I could use a coffee." We left the office together, and as we walked to the nearby cafe, I tried to focus on the familiar path, the hum of the city around us, the gentle evening breeze, but all I could think about was how close he was. I noticed the small things now, the way he brushed his hair back from his forehead, the sound of his laugh, the warmth of his voice. It was overwhelming in the most intoxicating way. We ordered our drinks and found a quiet corner to sit. The conversation flowed easily at first, just casual talk about work, the weather, and the usual pleasantries. But soon the talk turned to more personal things, as it often did when I was with him. He asked me about my life, my passions, and what I truly wanted. It felt strange to be asked those questions by someone who had only known me for a short time, but somehow it felt important. "You seem like you've got everything together," Jason said, his eyes fixed on me. "But there's something behind your eyes, like you're holding back." I froze. My mind raced, but my mouth couldn't find the words. How could I explain the emptiness I'd been feeling? How could I tell him that I was suffocating in a life I had once thought I wanted? Before I could respond, he reached across the table, his hand lightly touching mine. My breath hitched. The moment stretched out, like time itself had slowed. It wasn't just the warmth of his hand on mine. It was the way it felt right, in a way that nothing had felt right in a long time. "You don't have to talk about it," he whispered, his voice low and soothing. "But I'm here, whenever you're ready." The kindness in his words, the way he genuinely saw me, caught me off guard. I wasn't used to being seen like that. Not by David, not by anyone. My chest tightened, and for a moment I felt like I might cry, but instead I swallowed hard, forcing back the tears. Jason's gaze never wavered, his fingers still lightly brushing against mine, sending electric shivers up my arm. I knew then that I was standing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. And then, without warning, he leaned in. It was slow, deliberate, and I should have stopped it. I should have pulled away, told him we couldn't do this, that I was married, but I didn't. I didn't want to. When his lips touched mine, it was like a spark had ignited, hot, sudden, and consuming. The world around us disappeared. There was no work, no responsibilities, no thoughts of David. There was only him, only Jason, and the overwhelming feeling that I was finally alive again. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I knew that. But in that moment, with his lips against mine, I couldn't bring myself to care. The kiss was the answer to everything I had been craving, the answer to the emptiness inside me that I had tried to ignore for so long. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the beginning of something I couldn't walk away from, something that was going to change everything. As we pulled away, both of us breathless, I felt a rush of guilt wash over me. but it was quickly replaced by something else, something darker, more thrilling, something I hadn't felt in years. The days after that kiss were a blur, a confusing mix of guilt and exhilaration. Every time I saw Jason, my heart would race in a way that terrified me and thrilled me all at once. Our conversations had shifted, now laced with a deeper intimacy, a tension that simmered just beneath the surface. The office felt different. Every glance, every word exchanged between us was charged, like we were sharing a secret no one else could see. I tried to go back to my routine with David, to pretend that everything was normal, but it was impossible. I couldn't focus during dinners or conversations. My mind would wander to the feel of Jason's lips on mine, the way his hand had held mine in that cafe, the way his presence seemed to stir something inside me that I thought had been dead for years. David had no idea. He continued with his gentle, predictable gestures, asking about my day and making small talk, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside me. He was still the same, reliable, constant, but it felt like I was living two lives. And the more I went through the motions with him, the more suffocating it became. Jason, on the other hand, was a whirlwind. Every time I saw him, I felt alive, like I was stepping into a world full of possibility and excitement. Our time together was intoxicating. We would meet for brief, stolen moments at work, exchanging glances or sharing a word, but it was always followed by a fire inside me that wouldn't go out. I couldn't keep doing this, could I? I kept asking myself that question, as though I could somehow will myself to stop the pull toward him, but every time I tried to step away, it felt like there was something stronger pulling me back. One night, Jason texted me, asking if I wanted to meet for drinks after work. There was no pretending anymore. I knew exactly what this meant. I knew where this was headed, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. But the thought of not seeing him, of ignoring the connection that had grown between us, felt impossible. I replied quickly, "Yes, I'd love to." We met at a bar not far from the office. The atmosphere was dim, cozy, the kind of place that felt private, intimate, like no one else could reach us there. Jason was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table in the back. He looked up when I walked in, his face lighting up in that familiar way that made my stomach flip. He stood as I approached, pulling out the chair for me. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I sat down, my heart hammering in my chest. The air between us felt thick with anticipation. The drinks arrived, but neither of us paid much attention to them. We talked for hours, but it wasn't small talk. It was deep, raw, and personal. He wanted to know everything about my life, my fears, my desires, and somehow I found myself opening up to him in ways I had never opened up to anyone, not even David. Jason listened, really listened. It wasn't just words to him. It was like he was absorbing every part of me, understanding things I hadn't even known I needed to say. And with each passing minute, the pull between us grew stronger, more undeniable. At some point, the conversation slowed, and for a long moment, we just sat there, the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air. The world outside seemed to blur, and all I could focus on was him. His eyes, his expression, the way his lips parted slightly as he studied me. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, as if he could sense my hesitation, my inner battle. "But I think you want to." I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew what he was talking about. It wasn't just the kiss anymore. It was more than that. It was about stepping into the unknown, about giving in to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But in that moment, it felt like everything else had fallen away. All the doubts, the guilt, the fears, they all seemed insignificant compared to the fire that was burning inside me. I didn't say anything, but I didn't need to. Jason leaned in slowly, his hand reaching out to touch mine. There was no hesitation this time. There was no voice in my head telling me to stop. I leaned in too, closing the gap between us, and as our lips met once again, I felt the world shift beneath me. This time, there was no pulling away, no fear, Just the raw, unrelenting feeling that whatever this was, it had already begun, and there was no turning back. The moment was irreversible, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't care about the consequences. I only cared about the feeling of being alive, truly alive, in a way I hadn't felt in years.